It's Wednesday, February 24th, 2021, and this is another socially distant edition of KBIA's Views of the News. I'm Amy Simons, coming to you from the studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute. And my colleagues, Ernest Perry and Kiely, are with me as always via Skype for our weekly conversation on media behaviors. Hi, Ernest.
Hi, Amy.
Good to
Hi,
have
everybody.
Good to have you here. And Kathy, it's good to have you here with us today, too.
Hi, Amy.
On our program this week, covering the Texas power crisis from every angle, what happened, why it happened, and we're going to talk about Ted Cruz's Cancun vacation, too. Facebook has reached an agreement with the Australian government after a week of back and forth, which led to a ban on the sharing of news content in that country. And
this is our story.
A PBS documentary that brings America into the Black church, a study from the Pew Research Center that also shows that on the whole, we as the news media are missing a huge segment of our audience, not paying enough attention to the importance of faith within the Black community. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our half hour is up today, but we're going to start with the grim milestone reached Monday, 500,000 American lives lost to COVID-19. The New York Times had yet another poignant cover on Sunday, covering most of page one in a mosaic, 1 point for each person lost. Pointer's Roy Peter Clark wrote an appreciation of the design, drawing a connection between the typography term for a block of impenetrable gray text with what we were seeing on the page. That being a tombstone. Earnest, this week has been a grim reminder of how far we really are from the end of this pandemic and the costs that it's had to our nation already. Talk for a minute about how we mark these milestones.
Well, I think the New York Times piece, I opened that up on Sunday morning, and I just sort of stared at it for quite a long while, and then I sort of started reading the stories surrounding it, which I thought was very, very good and very poignant as well. I mean, we see a lot of images, and we've seen a lot of very graphic images of death and grief surrounding the pandemic. But I think it's those still photos again that really sort of captures the moment and sort of it places it in history. And I think that's what this sort of mosaic that the New York Times did. It's not a photo, but it is a almost a piece of artwork that really captures the moment. I mean, and when I say the moment, I'm talking about it captures the entire year that we've lived in a way that I think is very memorable.
It's interesting. The Pictures of the Year International is going on, and that run through the School of Journalism, the judging for that right now. And there are new categories this year specifically tied to COVID-19 and the coverage of that. And I offered some of my students in the course I teach for non-journalism majors extra credit to sit in on some of that and write me a reflection on what they observed, not only on the screen looking at the images, but hearing the judges who are esteemed photojournalists and photo editors, hearing them discuss some of those and choose some of the most powerful images taken this year. And what really stands out to me is, again, non-journalists, people outside of our profession who have been stopped in their tracks looking at those still images of the people who are facing this virus every single day. If that's the people who have fallen ill, if that's the loved ones, if that's the first responders, the doctors, the nurses who are caring for people, that collective grief and the power of those images.
Yeah,
I mean, that's,
No, go ahead, Ernest, and then we'll bounce
Ernest.
back to Kathy.
No, I was going to say, I mean, it is those images. I mean, even one of the things that I've heard people talk about is, in particular, in the last couple of months, that we've since the vaccines have come out and they're starting to be distributed, is asking the question: are we becoming numb to the devastation that has been caused by COVID. And I would say that I don't think we're at that point. I mean, especially in light of what happened earlier this week when we reached that 500,000 milestone, and the way in which President Biden and his administration chose to commemorate that, I think really speaks to that the point of, no, we haven't reached a point yet where this is numb and this is ordinary or this is normal. This is very tragic, and it is something that we need to be aware of and also understand that we're not out of it yet.
Kathy, you were about to say too.
Yeah, I think, well, one thing that the New York Times graphic does is show how quickly this has accelerated. I mean, we reached 500,000, it seems like, and it was just weeks ago after we were talking about 400,000 as an unimaginable landmark. And so you can see, as we're watching on the screen, how quickly those landmarks start to come over and over again, and that's very dramatic. The photographs, I think, what I was going to say is, I think the reason the still photos are so powerful, they are what the great photographer, and really in many ways the father of photojournalism, Henri Cartier-Bresson, called the decisive moment. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is what still photography captures more than anything else. It just freezes somebody in time. And of course, that's all what we'd like to do for the people we've lost.
So we were talking about grief and this collective national grief. And Earnest, you were saying, like, are we becoming numb? And I don't know that we're at a numb phase yet, but I think there definitely are people who have reached a phase of anger. And Kathy, part of that is we start to see and hear some of the stories, specifically like coming out of New York with Governor Andrew Cuomo, coming out that he was misreporting some of the deaths and the numbers of deaths in nursing homes. And people are getting angry as that news is coming out as we move into a different phase. That specific story, though, brings questions about the journalism ethics that are at play there, too, given his cozy relationship with CNN and his brother and as one of their primetime hosts. Talk about that for a minute, because this is something you brought to my attention as something you wanted to talk about today.
Well, it's a very strange, that is a very strange relationship between CNN and the governor of New York, and why they let Chris Cuomo interview his brother on TV is beyond me. I think it's a complete violation of journalistic ethics. It's one thing to have two brothers, one a politician and another a TV personality, there's no problem there. But to allow those to intersect, I mean, there have been some incredibly awkward interviews. And there was one, this recent one, I think the one you're referring to, where Chris Cuomo kind of just glossed over that little awkward piece of news. So I think there's a lot of anger generally. There's anger over the lockdowns. There's anger over the losses. People are tired of COVID. But I think we really need to mature as a society and understand that this is something, it's with us. We may not be able to stop it, but we can certainly control it. We can make it better. I think Governor Cuomo's response, particularly after he has been so lauded for his response for being open and honest, and then to cover this up, it was a lack of political courage. And why do politicians never learn that the cover-up is worse than the problem you're trying to cover up? And the lack of transparency just fuels public suspicion. And right now, when we're in a health crisis, the last thing we need is more public suspicion about authorities who are trying to advise us about health.
Well, if ever there was a segue, you just gave me one, because we're going to talk about a lot of what has been going on in the past week. You know, last week was cold here in mid-Missouri, and while we were asked to consider ways to conserve power, and while there was a small threat that some providers might need to consider rolling blackouts, it was nothing like what was happening down in Texas. And Earnest, I want to start by asking you, as our resident Texas expert, to help do some of the explanatory reporting for us that we saw in a lot of the national and the business media about how Texas found itself in this position in the first place, thanks to deregulation of its utilities.
Well, as a native Texan, I can say that this was not the Republic's best showing when it comes to taking care of its people. Probably the best way to put it is that this was deregulation gone amok, and I would say it was about 1999, 1998. The state allowed its utilities to basically go out and begin to do what's called variable rate services for its customers. So say you could pay $200 for. As a matter of fact, a lot of people were at this point were paying $200 a month because you're paying as you go. And then what happened is you have this big deep freeze. The utilities are really trying to push, trying to get the electricity going up, and those who had electricity, who didn't lose electricity, are now at the point where they're paying $10,000 or more a month for the electricity bill, whereas it was $200. The deregulation of the electrical grid and the natural gas grid within the state of Texas is what led to this, because there was not enough investment. And so when the deep freeze hit, these companies were unable to handle the load of everyone being on the grid, trying to heat their houses and keep their pipes from freezing. And so you had the power, basically the power devastation that happened during the freeze, and now the water devastation that's happening and right now in the state. Matter of fact, I just got on my mom. She has running water in Houston, but there are several other family members who are dealing with busted pipes that won't get fixed until either later this week or early next week, because it's just a complete mess, and it all revolves around the fact that the state allowed deregulation, and that deregulation led to a lack of investment that led to what happened last week.
And so,
go ahead, this financial devastation with these people getting these ridiculous bills. I mean, it's like Texas is running its utility grid as though it's Uber at rush hour. You know, you can make a decision
in a thunderstorm. Uber at rush hour in a thunderstorm.
Uber, but you can't make a decision about whether or not you need to turn on the electricity when it's below zero. So it's really, really Texas looked like a third world country last week, and how totally embarrassing.
Well, and to add to it, they're also developed a war against information. What became a misinformation campaign is those with different political interests found ways to point fingers. Conservative members of the state government, those who I think might have been in favor of deregulation back in the 90s, they started blaming it on frozen turbines and saying that renewable energy was the source of the problem, which put journalists at Texas Tribune, there's a great piece on our Links blog explaining that, like, those turbines weren't frozen. This was not about frozen turbines, and wind energy was not the problem here.
Well, this was about the lack of adequate infrastructure in terms of natural gas and in terms of other electrical means. I mean, here's the problem.
Yeah.
They did not have the insulation. Texas is a natural
like
gas.
People in their homes didn't have the insulation, you
No.
mean?
The natural gas pipeline that fueled the electrical grid did not have insulation, and when the freeze came in, it froze those pipes and the natural gas couldn't move. Therefore, the electrical grid could not be serviced. And that's what basically led to the loss of power. And that loss of power led to the freezing in the homes, which led to the pipes being frozen because they don't have the insulation that we have up here north. Mm-hmm. And then, boom, there you go. That's basically.
And it's also about it's about climate change denial. I mean, that's why Texas is getting severe weather, like we're all getting unusual weather patterns, which is exactly what the climate change scientists have predicted. And unless and until we make the kind of investments Earnest is talking about, this stuff is just going to happen. It's going to keep happening. But some of the conservative politicians you mentioned, Amy, are among the leading climate change deniers. So, again, we need to grow up and understand, we shouldn't be living on the big river called denial. We need to come to grips with our problems and do it together as a society instead of finger pointing, which is a really immature way to respond to these kind of problems.
And the other thing here, Amy, is that the journalists in the state of Texas have been talking about this problem for the last decade and a half. They have really been focusing in on, going all the way back to Hurricane Harvey and even before that, when they had very bad tropical storms that would basically come and sit over southeast Texas for days and days and days and flood the place. What really brought this home is that the entire state was impacted by this. So in all these other natural disasters that they've had over the last 10 to 15 years, it's been sort of localized in certain areas, tornadoes in North Texas, hurricanes down in the Houston area or further south than that. But this was a storm that basically took out everything in the state of Texas, and that is why you're seeing journalists saying, we've been talking about this, we've been outlining this, but this is a story that we can talk about that has an impact on the entire infrastructure of the state, and that's where the anger is really coming from right now.
So you talk about the journalists and the work that they were doing, and we often end up talking about, especially during these natural disasters like hurricanes, about the challenges that journalists face in covering it in the moment, because they too are experiencing a lack of water, a lack of power in their newsrooms, in their homes, their own families being affected about it. Kathy, tell us about some of the creative ways that local outlets found the way to still serve the public's need for information, especially at times when they may not have had the power to power up the device or to get to a newsstand to even pick up a paper if they were even able to put a physical one there.
Well, I think this is in many ways journalists' finest hour. When in the middle of a disaster, when, as you say, you are yourself a victim of the disaster, finding ways to get the news out anyway. In this case, I think it was even more extreme because journalists really weren't in newsrooms where you tend to have a support service. There tend to be emergency generators, that kind of thing. But because of COVID, a lot of people are working out of their homes and are just as vulnerable to all of the things we've just been talking about as any other citizen, which I think makes them better journalists in many ways. And so what you found is people kludging ways to get enough of a connection to get power on, using their cell phones as hotspots, getting things out. And the news organizations, a number of them, used an interesting service that we're seeing, we're talking about more and more in the industry, which is texting to get news to people as opposed to the web or more conventional broadcast systems. And the reason for that is if you don't have power and you don't have the internet, you still have a cell signal. And as long as you have a cell signal, you can get the news out. So a number of these organizations used a service called Subtext to just text news out and new developments. And obviously these are, life and death for some people, where you can go for heat, where you can go for water. So it was, I think this is an example when people wonder about journalism and what's the point. If you didn't have these news organizations, you are losing a vital channel of information, which can really make a big difference for people in an emergency.
Okay, so then there's another storyline that maybe in covering the life and death aspects of this story became a bit of a distraction. There was Ted Cruz's Cancun vacation. This was one of those stories broken by citizen journalists, people who saw him at the airport and saw our crew on the standby list, knowing his legal first name is Rafael, and snapped that pic on the plane. Kathy, getting the story out about this, it's about those tips. Talk for a second about how vital citizen journalists can be for us in cases like this.
Yeah, well, this is one of those examples where everybody's a publisher these days, and one of the things we have to do in newsrooms is verify those pictures when they come in. But it did check out, and Cruz himself was forced to acknowledge that he had in fact taken a little break from the action in Texas, and then. There were later, I think there was a leak of the group chat messages that his wife had been sending to their neighbors.
Ernest is laughing just thinking about them.
It's like we tell our students, nothing on the internet is private.
Well, right. And so, Ernest, this was one of those stories that as it unfolded over the course of a couple of days, every single incident was like, wait, what? Did it just get worse?
Absolutely. It got worse.
It did. And this was the trip that he was.
You say, God bless Texas.
Right. He was supposed to return the next day, only then a reporter on the street notices a dog in the window. Then there were those texts. There had to have been a lot of work done in a very little time. And as a credit to the reporters doing it, they got the story right, and they got it right down to the name of that dog, which is ironically Snowball.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think what happened is that, people were they couldn't believe it. I mean, the one thing that during all of this that the entire state could galvanize behind was their vitriolic just anger at Ted Cruz and the fact that he would do that. And to me, that was the thing that just sort of galvanized the state. And I can tell you, the person who was probably the happiest that Ted Cruz did that was the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, because it took a lot of heat off of him for what was going on. So he's probably thanking Ted Cruz profusely right now.
Wow.
Yeah, and number two is Beto O'Rourke, whose star is rising. There's a story today in Politico about that. So. Wow. The guy Ted Cruz beat just barely.
Wow. What's interesting is the vitriol was there now. It wasn't there on January 7th. I'm looking at the clock. I want to make sure we have time to talk about a couple of other things today, including a documentary. You might have caught part, if not all, of The Black Church. This is our story. This is our song on PBS last week.
The Black Church was more than just a spiritual home. It was the epic center of Black life. Out of it came our Black businesses, our Black educational institutions.
The Black Church gave people a sense of value, belonging, and worthiness. I don't know how we could have survived as a people without it.
To tell the story of American religion is to tell a political story.
The Black Church helped us to withstand all the slings and arrows of segregation and the segregationists.
The Los Angeles Times television editor Matt Brennan wrote that to call this 4-hour series a kaleidoscopic would be to undersell its breadth, and that it centers on the influence of the Black church, as you heard Oprah Winfrey say, there as being central to the heartbeat of the Black American experience, from music to business to politics. Ernest, your second most used catchphrase on this program is context, and that we can't carry out excellent journalism when we're not putting our work into context. This 4 hours of television lays the groundwork for a lot of the context that's been missing in the way that journalists that we've been covering the Black experience in 2021, and how not covering the church really does hurt our ability to cover Black communities.
Well, yes, it does, because the Black church is the main institution within, and has been going all the way back to slavery, one of the main institutions within the Black community. And quite often, I mean, journalists, especially the mainstream journalists, have had a problem doing this because they try to cover it from a political, institutional way, and that's not the way to do it, because it is an emotional thing. It is an attachment. It is a part of the community, and you have to cover it from that perspective and deeply understand it. But to be honest, the mainstream media has a problem covering religion. Regardless of what you're talking about, the Black community, the white community, we have a problem covering religion, because I think a lot of it goes back to not really fully understanding that emotional attachment. Even when they cover the conservative movement and evangelicals, they have the same problem because they want to put them in this sort of political box, and the political box is only a part of religious institutions, and it's not the main part of how religious institutions connect individually with people and communities as a whole.
So, Kathy, there was a Pew Research study that came out this week as well that said that one of the things we can do better is tying into the different aspects of life, those emotional aspects that Earnest was talking about, happening in some of the church. Can you give some examples about how having that data in the hands of journalists can help inform our reporting choices?
Well, I think, I think data it's important, but I think Ernest really hit it on the head. I think we are uncomfortable covering emotions, and we tend to cover churches as institutions, and they are institutions, but they are emotional receptacles too, and they carry a lot of attachments. They're incredibly powerful. I think a lot of journalists do, at least in the Black community and in the conservative community, look to churches and look to church leaders. But whether we really fully understand the emotional nature of those ties, I think that's another question. And since we're on the subject of the Black church, I want to give a huge shout out to KBIA, which every Black History Month runs the gospel roots of rock and roll. And I love that show, and I wish it ran every week.
Well, and music was a very big part in explaining the history of gospel in this documentary. If you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, it is available on the pbs.org website. I just got a text from our control room. I want to stand corrected. Ted Cruz's dog's name is in fact Snowflake, not Snowball. So I misspoke there. We have about a minute or two before.
Special snowflake.
Yes, very much so. Wow, the irony. We have just about 2 minutes before our show is up today. I want to talk about something that has been going on down under, I mean, quite literally in Australia, between that country's government and Facebook. It started when Facebook blocked users from posting news content to the network, because the government proposed a series of media bargaining laws which would force tech giants like Facebook and Google to pay Australian news outlets for the content. So middle of last week, it became impossible to share those stories on Facebook. Kathy, yesterday Facebook and the Aussie government reached a deal releasing this block. What are some of the changes expected in the proposed legislation?
Well, I think Facebook is going to have to start paying publishers for content. And I think this is a really important move, because it could mean that other countries will look and ask for the same thing. I think that's why Facebook fought it. I think it was an absolutely tone-deaf thing that they did. They just called attention to the monopoly they have. And I think you'll see more government regulation to come, not just in Australia.
So the fact, Earnest, that Facebook was able to put this pressure on the Australian government, who would you kind of point to as the winner in this one? Is it the government? Is it the Australian people? Or is it Facebook?
Well, I think that's going to be an open question, because it's not over with yet. Facebook still has the antitrust lawsuit here. They're still fighting the EU. It's not over yet, but Mark Zuckerberg has basically sent a message that he's willing to go gangster on anybody who tries to control his operation.
That's an image. Mark Zuckerberg going gangster. Well, that music means we are pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next time, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll see you in 2 weeks when we're back with another Views of the News.